Despite high uncertainties about the path of the COVID-19 pandemic, a way out of the crisis is becoming increasingly visible. That is the cautious but optimistic forecast offered by the International Monetary Fund's chief economist, Geeta Gopinath, as she presented the institution's latest World Economic Outlook report early this week on Tuesday. In it, the IMF said it expects the global economy to expand by 6% this year, up half a percentage point from its forecast in January and 0.8 percentage points up from October. South Korea's forecast has also been revised up from 3.1 to 3.6%. To learn more about the upgraded numbers as well as what risks remain, we have joining us on the line now Andreas Bauer, the Assistant Director of the Asia and Pacific Department at the IMF and also the Korea Mission Chief. Hello, Mr. Bauer. It's great to have you back on the show again.
Hello, great to be with you.
So the IMF released its World Economic Outlook report on Tuesday. If I go over the numbers again, the IMF said it expects the global economy to grow 6% this year, up from its 5.5% forecast in January, and that was already revised up from the October forecast. Can you give us more details about the IMF's outlook? What led to the upward revision?
Yes, well, I think overall our latest World Economic Outlook delivers good news. So the global recovery is continuing and the prospects for growth have improved relative to what we previously assessed. Both the contraction actually in 2020 last year was smaller than anticipated, and also we have lifted our growth forecast for this year, as you mentioned. The smaller contraction last year reflected mainly better than expected growth in the second half after countries reopened their economies from lockdowns. And this was really driven by the unprecedented policy response that central banks and governments took after the outbreak, and also by the faster than expected adaptation of businesses, to working in a pandemic environment. Our upgrade of the 2021 forecast really reflects additional fiscal support that a few of the advanced countries, especially the United States, is providing. And we're also anticipating a vaccine-powered further recovery in the second half of the year across our membership.
Right, so recovery efforts are going somewhat smoothly, it seems then. However, risk factors do remain, don't they? How much could the pandemic still weigh on the global economy in 2021?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very important to recognize that the uncertainty regarding the global outlook remains really exceptionally high. And I would say that the further development really depends first and foremost on the path of the health crisis. That includes the rollout of vaccines, of course, but also whether the new COVID variants that we see popping up across countries prove susceptible to the vaccines or whether they actually prolong the pandemic. So negative news on the health front, I would say, are certainly among the most important downside risks to the outlook that we see. And in that sense, the recent surges of infections in a number of relatively large countries are, of course, a cause for concern. But there are also other factors that will determine how 2021 will turn out for the global economy, including the duration and the effectiveness of the policy support, the evolution of financial conditions and commodity prices, and also how firms and households respond. For example, if we do see a premature withdrawal of fiscal, monetary, and financial sector support, we could see a slowdown in the recovery compared to our forecast. On the other hand, in certain countries, income transfers and the lack of spending opportunities have led to a large increase in private household savings. And these savings could be unleashed and could transform into more consumption, if confidence rises and uncertainty fades, and that would then add actually more to the recovery than what we currently see. Overall, if we take it all together, we think that the risk to the outlook for 2021 is probably more or less balanced, which means that the likelihood that growth will either fall short or exceed our forecast is about the same.
Right, so there are still some uncertainties that could factor into the growth, but we'll have to see, depending on how the pandemic pans out, especially in the coming months with the vaccine rollouts around the world. Now, the IMF chief economist Gita Gopinath also said that not all countries are expected to enjoy even growth, projecting that low-income and developing countries hit hard by the pandemic will see a slower recovery compared to advanced economies. Could you elaborate more on this divergence between advanced and lesser developed economies?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point to understand where we're heading. So what has improved is really the overall outlook for the global economy when we aggregate everything. But if you look across the world, the extent and the pace of the recovery varies widely across countries. And in general, emerging market economies and developing countries, or low-income developing countries, as we call them, they have been hit harder by the pandemic, and we also expect them to suffer more from the medium-term scars that the pandemic will leave on the economies. And in particular, I think the losses have been large in countries that depend on tourism and on commodity exports, and also in countries that have had more limited policy space. These countries have come into the pandemic with high debt levels, and they just didn't have the capacity to mount a vigorous health policy response and to support the livelihood of its citizens as much as would have been desirable. To put that in perspective, I think overall we estimate that about 95 million people around the world have fallen below the income threshold that defines extreme poverty compared to the estimates we had before the pandemic. And that's, of course, a big source of concern. Now, to help speed up the recovery in these more severely affected countries and reverse these negative social implications, what will be key is to ensure really sufficient worldwide vaccine production and universal distribution at an affordable cost, so that all these countries can quickly beat back the pandemic and return their economies to a more normal state and start a vigorous recovery.
Let's look at South Korea now in a bit more detail. According to the IMF, South Korea's economy is expected to grow 3.6% this year, and that's up half a percentage point from the agency's forecast issued in January. Can you tell us more about this IMF's outlook for South Korea this year?
Yeah, I think we have discussed that before. The Korean economy has weathered the COVID storm comparatively well. Of course, the economy suffered a recession last year, but this recession was much milder than what we saw in most other advanced economies. Real GDP started to recover in the third quarter of last year, when mobility restrictions were lifted, lockdowns were lifted in Korea, but also in Korea's trading partners. We expect this recovery to continue at a healthy pace throughout 2021 as well. Now, we have upgraded growth for this year, as you mentioned, to 3.6%. And that upgrade had really both external and domestic drivers. So on the external front, we have upgraded growth for many of Korea's important trading partners, especially the United States, China, and also several European countries. That means more demand for Korea's exports, and that is positive economic activity. These are the external drivers. As for domestic drivers, the National Assembly has approved recently a supplementary budget of 0.8% of GDP, and that budget will provide additional support, especially for consumption, and that again will be positive for growth. And this is why we have revised growth upwards. Now, let me just say briefly that while we see robust growth in 2021, the growth will continue to be somewhat uneven across the economy, across sectors.
Right.
So far, really, what has driven the recovery has been the manufacturing sector and the manufacturing export sector, especially tech products as well, benefiting from higher demand for connectivity around the world. But the service, especially the services that require personal contacts, have been weaker, and as an extension of that, consumption has been weaker. And we think that will take some time to reverse as there continue to be restrictions on mobility going forward, as long as we have these COVID cases. So we will see a bit of a two-phased recovery in this year.
Right, so an uneven recovery. And as with the rest of the world, there are risk factors remain here in South Korea concerning how the COVID-19 situation develops as well, I'm assuming. For example, there are concerns of another wave of the virus right now with cases on the rise again, as well as concerns about a vaccine rollout not being able to meet its original targets. How could these factors weigh on the economy for Korea this year?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think progress on vaccination will be key for the Korean outlook in 2021, both in Korea and outside. So a fast rollout outside, of course, would help the outlook in trading partners and therefore by extension Korea as well. But the domestic rollout of vaccines is important, especially to normalize the services sector. And the service sector, again, is important for employment as well. So it will be critical, of course, for the government to deliver on its plans to accelerate the distribution of vaccines, the inoculation rhythm, and to inoculate. I think the goal is about 70% by the end of the year. This is what we are assuming in our forecast. In terms of economic policies, I think the Bank of Korea and the Ministry of Finance have already articulated that they will continue to provide supportive fiscal and monetary policy. And we think that is very appropriate given how uneven the recovery still is. And I think that also limits some of the downside risks. Korea has policy space, and so there is some muscle there that can be deployed if needed, if things turn out a bit worse. I would also say that while, of course, the policy focus has to be on on the immediate recovery, it's also always good to look forward and invest a bit in the future. We know that Korea is aging quickly, and that has social implications. It also pushes down growth over the medium term. The Korean government has already put forward its Korean New Deal that is intended to increase inclusiveness and also to develop new growth drivers, especially in the digital area and in green growth. And that is, of course, very helpful. We think this should be complemented with broader reforms that address some of the longer standing rigidities that the economy has in terms of its product markets and labor markets, increase competition to stimulate more innovation, especially with the sector, which is a bit of a laggard in terms of productivity. But overall, I think I would say that the Korean economy is on a good track, but it will be important to continue to provide policy support to entrench this recovery and to also increase the potential growth of the economy.
Well, Mr. Bauer, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today and briefing us on the perspective from the IMF. And we certainly hope for a smooth economic recovery this year, despite concerns. We've been speaking to Andreas Bauer, the Assistant Director of the Asia and Pacific Department at the IMF via video link. And our listeners can watch this interview back on our KBS World Radio YouTube page as well. Mr. Bauer, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.